Welcome everyone, this is Tristan McGough. Today, in Intermediate Selfology, we are going to be covering the Orchestral Personality, the 24 Personae, or sub-personalities if you will, that each of us have sort of as a circle of engagement with our empirical world. Today, your philosopher at large is going to begin with the 10 dimensions of self. Just as a reminder, when we're dealing with the orchestral personality, very quickly, what we're dealing with are the various sub-personalities or personae. That is the various adaptive roles that are specifically taken in our life world. However, on the inside of that is our epistic self. It's our psychical self. It's the self that is feeling and doing and willing. And this self, this internal self, which has its own innerscape, is the very cauldron in which your feelings are going to be expressed through the orchestral personality in one of its various roles. But first of all, I want to remind you what the 10 dimensions of self actually are that go into, if you will, the mix of the psychical self, the soul, the self-conscious being. The one that when we reflect, we go, well, that's I, or that's me. The me, of course, is always the generated reflection of what you think you are. You're the one that's generating that reflection. So you, in all of us, have an epistemic relation in which we, or I, as the subject, am generating my object. Whatever object is going to be taken, whether it's through sensation or through internal mentation, I am going to interpret it according from my own subjective perspective. And that's one of the dimensions to the self. The self has 10 dimensions, and it's best if we look at those very quickly in terms of this, and I'll list them here. We start off with the bodily self, which is the living dimension. That's your 5 basic senses. And of course, we amplify those with interior senses and a sense of equilibrium, but it's basically your passive senses that allow you to maintain balance in the world. And then there are, of course, your motor senses that allow you to be expressive and active in the world. So these two sets together constitute, we'll just call them the 10 senses. 5 passive, 5 active, and what they allow us to do is engage with this empirical, this finite world. And then there's what we just referred to, the perspectival self. Each of us has a unique perspective we take upon the world, do we not? Not just physically, in terms of how we're situated in space-time, causes, and entities, but as well as how we have an approach to the world, a perspective we take in terms of our sentiments and attitudes and temperament and the general life experience being interpreted by way of a worldview as well as your specific contents of experience. But you have your perspectival self, which is, of course, this observing dimension to self. Then we have a feeling self, or the emotional dimension. The emotional self is the self in which you engage within delight and pleasure and aversion and attachment, all the various feelings that go along with sentiments, emotions, and affections. Of course, we have a narrating self, and that's our thinking self. That's that intellectual self we all have. And that dialogue is an internal dialogue, and that's part of what is, in a larger scope, part of a social self, because we learn that, of course, from others. But there's another dimension besides the thinking and narrating and the emotional and the bodily and the perspectival, and that, of course, is the volitional self. And that's the self where we believe ourselves as a sovereign agency that has an autonomous will and can make free choice. And we have, as I've just alluded to, the social self. And this is actually an imagining dimension, because the social self is where we construct ideas of what people have a vision of what we are. We see ourselves in the image we think they're seeing us in. And that begins very early in terms of life in which we are addressed. And our entityship is called out, if you will, because it does not exist when the amorphic consciousness of an infant. But this is something that the potentials are called out through social exercise and interaction, which is, of course, part of what is building the 24 personae. A baby doesn't have these personae. A baby is very much like, if you will, a blank tablet. Of course, there's an incredible amount of DNA and nervous system, etc., organization going on, but at the same time, they're very plastic and adaptable. They're adaptable as much from their interior spiritual entityship as a soul that is reincarnated as much as they are being influenced by the outside world. So besides these various selves and the social self, we have the enduring self, which is the continuing self. It's the self you wake up to every morning. It's the self you return to in memory, and you go, I was there at such and time. And it's the self you hope to catch up to in the future when you say, well, I'm going to go to so-and-so's house for a birthday party. Then there's the organizing self, and that's the unifying self. All these other selves don't go flying off in other dimensions. They're all organized. They're all unified around a conscious center, and in this case, a self-conscious reflective center that we refer to as the epistic self, or the soul, or the solar self, or the psyche, or the psychical self. They're all the same thing. This is the very foundation of the interior scape that we all experience. It's organized, however. And not only is it organized, it's advancing. How is it advancing? Because in the very moment that this self exists in all its various dimensions, it exists with potentials that are always being actuated within the ephemeral moment of the eternal now. The ephemeral moment of the eternal now is where you have presence. There is presencing of being. Being presences itself. Plus, you have what you experience, we all experience as the present, right? The present moment. And then there's the present object, right? There's a present object or a set of objects that are there. But there's also the very potency, the very quality, the very possibility of presencing, and what I call presentivity. Presentivity is that quality of something being present. It could not be present if it didn't have that quality. And then there is, of course, the presenting, such as I'm presenting certain things, and you see that in the active dynamic world that we all live in. This is all part of the package of the present. And the present is a gift from the universe to you. And this is your advancing self, because you are advancing from a state of potential to a state of actuality. And then there's the identifying self, which is the singularity dimension. Because every time that you, as a singular self, an idiosyncratic singular self, an individual self, behold your various dimensions, which are your powers of self. Look on all of these as the powers of self. It is always identified as being the same self. It is not a continuous self, as we spoke of before, which has a sense of continuing in time. Not necessarily serial time, but certainly continuing to evolve and flourish and fluoresce in time, to expand in time, to reach to all one's possibilities as being actualities in time. And that, of course, occurs as the ephemeral moment in which we see things arise and abide and then subside. And that's the same with everything that occurs here within this productive world of the empiric self. Now, the empiric self, or your personality, which is what your orchestra actually is composed of with the persona, is a reflection of what's going on in your interior states. And very quickly, these 10 dimensions feed into you being an actual human being that has the power of will and the power of thought and the power of feeling or of heart and the power of doing, of action, of life. All of this is the center of the orchestral personality, and these are the 24 persona for social interface in a cultural world. A cultural world is a meaningful world. A cultural world is a world with signs and symbols and signatures with meanings. And all of these meanings are based upon the way that as a psyche, as a soul that has all of these interior states going on in an interior scape of self-conscious being, at the same time, we are connected empirically with a finite world. The we, as transfight conscious beings, the feeling you're having now, the thoughts you're having now, that's transfinity. Transfinity isn't some mathematical abstraction that you have to comprehend in order to be. Transfinity is what you are at the psychical level, at the level of soul, at the level of self-consciousness. Self-consciousness integrates itself intuitively. And that intuition is awareness that knows perfectly well what it's feeling when it's feeling, what it's thinking, what it's thinking, what it's willing, what it's willing, what it's doing, when it is doing. However, all of those interior states of the inner scape are reflected in our connections to the outer scape. The outer scape, in which we have an ecologue, is different than our ego-log. Our ego-log is the dialogue that we're having with ourselves through all these various dimensions. We know what we're feeling, thinking, willing, etc., etc. We know what we're organizing, what we're advancing toward, what we're dismissing, what we're holding on to and attached to, what we're aversive of and we repel. We know these things psychically. However, the way we organize those feelings, those thoughts, those wills and resolutions, and that activity in this world is divided into certain, if you will, postures. That is, they are stations in life in which you, as a soul, will interact through your soma, that is, through your various personality vehicles. And these personality vehicles are personae. I've identified 24 of them. And I wanted to go over those with you basically today because they are extremely important. The way that you channel your feelings, the way that you express your thoughts, the way that you conduct your activities, the way that you actually resolve your difficulties through the power of will, are all done through conduits. And you can look upon the orchestral personality as really a set of instruments, very much like an orchestra, in which the composer is you as self-conscious being, as the soul, as a psyche that has these 5 basic capabilities of intuiting, willing, thinking, feeling, and doing. At that level, what you do is you organize adaptive roles that allow you to interact and transact with the finite world. And that's the natural world as well as the social world. And it's also, these roles themselves, all 24 of them, they're sustained by your epistic self, by your psyche or soul. They don't just operate on themselves. They're very much like instruments in an orchestra. And your conductor is the personality. That is your empiric self here that knows what's going on. Now, when we talk about the self as divided into the empiric self and the epistic self and the agnostic self, we're just saying spirit, that is awareness, soul, which is self-awareness, and then soma, your person, your personhood, your personality, which is being aware of other things, your other awareness. It's all you all together. These are just along, if you will, an axis of various fields of reality. So when you deal with your internal reality as a transfinite being, you need a soul, you need a center that allows you to do that in the same way that when you deal with the finite world, you need a center down here. And that's your conductor, that's your personality, that's the one who knows all the finite things about your memories, your losses, your strengths, your weaknesses, your goals, ideals, your fears, all of it, all those finite things. This is what the personality knows. The soul knows all those finite things in relation to one another and a good deal more from a higher plane. So it sees a lot more than just all these finite things that every once in a while we chop up into sections of perception or into segments of memory. So think of these as well as existential tentacles, each one of these. So let us take, for instance, one that I placed at the very bottom, the erotic, because that relates to the body. Particularly, your sense of having a body, and that body as it engages in the world. And that body as it engages in the world from infancy through puberty into the future is all based upon its identification with the body and its ability to perform. And it's a body's ability to perform along 2 functionary lines, pleasure and propagation. The pleasure, of course, relates to your own pleasurable states as a physical being, your sensory states and your sensual states. The other, the propagational, is perpetuity, and that has to do with your body as part of a macrocosm. The body itself, as your minicosm, is nonetheless, as you hold it, part of a larger picture. The larger picture in which all the laws of physics as well as psyche hold. And so your psyche as well as your physique are adherent to these macrocosmic laws. And your body is part of those macrocosmic laws in the same way that you as a microcosm of the universe are part of that. You're both part. That is all the cells in your body as well as you as a larger human being, inclusive not only of your personhood, but also of your spiritual nature. So when we deal with the erotic, we're dealing with basically 4 different components, and this is something that the body grows into as well as the person matures. As the person matures, they have to confront their body along these 2 lines, the pleasurable aspect as well as the propagational aspect. These are things that, if you will, puberty opens the door to. And now, the erotic element, of course, has its sexual or carnal side, but it also has a feeling and a romantic side. It has a conjugal or a will side, that is your marital side. And then there is a concertorial side that some couples develop, and that is the potential of all couples. And it's basically, if you will, a dyadic or a team spirit that endures past every carnal episode, past every romantic affection that you have with your partner, past every marital obligation that you fulfilled. There is something that deeper that will last and that will feed both of you as not only bodily entities, but as spiritual entities. And this is why that's a concertorial phase where the Mr. and Mrs. become basically a lord and a lady. They become masters of their own selves, and they've used the dyadic relationship of eroticism in order to advance not only each of them, but together, and very many others in the process, by way of the reverberations that happen because of the acts of kindness that should be generated in a truly fulfilling erotic relationship. But then there's and that erotic persona, as you can tell, is multifaceted. So it's something that one grows into. The erotic persona, like most of the other personae, are going to grow or evolve. For instance, you have a private persona. When you're all alone, you just act a certain way. You don't even think about it. But that's quite different than a persona that you would undertake with your mother or your father. You have a very different set of expectations, and you believe they have of yours through the social dimension and this imagining, this reflective imagining that goes on. You believe that they have certain expectations that you meet. Your father might have various requirements and demands. Your mother might be less demanding, always comforting, and as Erich Fromm would say, her love is unconditional. However, even here in the filial, and I had the alter filial, because we all have those adults that come into our lives that are elders, and we treat them very much as if they were a second parent. Well, all of these personae themselves, as you can tell, are highly individualistic. So though I can say that you have a particular persona that you will inhabit, a persona that you will habit when you're in the presence of your mother or your father, and perhaps you divide that so that you act quite differently with your mother sometimes, confide in her certain things you might not, in your father, or it could be completely reversed, and you confide more in your father. Regardless, there are all these specific tinctures, and that's based upon you as an individual. And as an individual, I'm talking about as a self-conscious individual with an interscape, as well as an orchestral personality that has these 24 different sub-personalities by which you can reach out and interact with the world. You can look at them in another sense as if they are like the dancers of the personality in action. It isn't as if they exist like an orchestra independently of one another, although they are semi-autonomous. And you will find yourself kicking into them whenever you're in the appropriate situation. So as a religious persona, when you go to church, you're going to have a particular way of acting. It'll be quite different than your artistic persona, where if you hang with a group of creative individuals and you're particularly artistic, you are called upon to be expressive, whether it's in painting, watercolors, music. It could be within lighting, it can be within installations, it can be within performance art. The idea is you craft consciously a certain set of skills that revolve around the beautiful. And this is what we're talking about in terms of your artistic persona. All these personae are developed. So therefore, somebody's historical persona may be much more developed if they've studied history and they've appreciated their ancestry than somebody who has not. And that will be the same with a good many other things. We all have a civic persona. Go to a ball game, go to a Rotary meeting, go to a town hall meeting. There is a certain civic persona that you adapt to and you have modified and that you cling to and you inhabit when you go within those social situations. Now that's different than a public persona. Now your public persona is when you go out in public, you are under, we all are under, an eye of anyone who's willing to look our way. So we have a sense of an indifference to everybody who might be paying attention to us, except those whom we wish to engage with one of our persona. There's a rule of civil disattention. It's called a residual rule in sociology. And that is where you act as if you are not attending to other people when you're in a social setting. Take like a cocktail party right before you have perhaps a lecture or something else that's going to occur. And everybody looks around and everybody does things and they even make eye contact. However, if you make eye contact in American culture for more than 3 or 4 seconds, you are meaning to engage that individual. And if you are doing so, you are doing so for 2 reasons. Either because it is a welcome or it is a threat. And the other individual is interpreting that. It's a residual rule. It's not one we're taught. It's one we pick up on, and there's a good many residual rules, such as how far we stand from people when we're talking to them. That varies by cultures and subcultural contexts. So you'll see that the orchestral personality is actually all these various instruments that at any time you can call upon to play a solo, but they're all at your disposal. So, including that, you have a class persona, a socioeconomic sense of where you stand on that ladder. You have a supervisory persona whenever you are put in charge of somebody. That could be a ward, a child that you're taking care of for a neighbor, you're babysitting. It could be an employee at work of which you are responsible to have them account to you for their performance. There's a professional persona, which is, of course, the persona that you assume that you profess. That can be your occupation or a vocation, or it can be a skilled trade or something else, such as a lawyer, doctor, whatever. The idea is, often, usually, you're paid for your professional services. That is, for the services you profess you're good at. And then there's, of course, and I spoke of this, the social persona, but we have all these others. Now, I did want to touch on a couple of others very quickly. Just in the same way that you have a persona that you fold into and that you've adapted, and that is an existential tentacle toward your parents. You also have that toward your siblings, and each one of them may be individual, but as a whole, depending on where you are in the sibling hierarchy, you'll tend to treat siblings above one way, siblings below another way. If you're a twin, fraternal, or identical, you may treat your sibling as peer-to-peer, as most do. And then there are extended family persona of your cousins and your distant cousins, etc. You have personae for your friends. You have personae for the peer group that you belong to. You have a learning persona that you learned in the classroom, whether it was in a structured classroom or a circular classroom or a natural classroom. You have a learning persona, and this can continue throughout life, in which you learn more and more and more, and this learning persona can grow, and become more erudite and refined, or you could have terminated it and at any point along your path of consciousness and folded in less of the world through learning. Then we all have what is called a rogue personality. Everyone has a rogue personality. That's the personality that can defy convention in order to attain a higher aim or a lower aim. A rogue personality can be somebody who's fleeing persecution, and they costume themselves so that they can slip over lines by impersonating someone else. That's a rogue personality. They're defying convention in order to attain an end. Now, they may be on a hegira, and it may be a very worthy end, or they may be on an end like an assassin. Then we have, of course, the political persona, which is the persona which is basically drafted as a member of a party. And a party is one that has more probably affective allegiance than it does have ideological content. Very often, the platform of a party, however articulated and well stated, may not represent what the party actually does. It's the difference between a espoused theory and a espoused theory, a theory that you say you believe in, and then your theory and practice, your practical beliefs that actually show what it is that you're made out of. And out of all these personalities, the ones toward the top, you'll notice I have a couple of here. I wanted to touch on the heroic persona. We all have a heroic persona. Sometimes that heroic persona as a dedicated mother, as a committed father, as a loyal spouse or partner. These are all acts of heroism. Why are they acts of heroism? Because they're the application of conscious will to an end that has been self-chosen, freely self-chosen. So the person crafts their conduct, and in the crafting of that conduct, they create a character that people can rely upon. This is the heroic persona. This differs from a secret persona. The secret persona, think of as the place that you retreat to in quiet, in privacy, and isolation, without anyone knowing about it. It is your calm, quiet center. It is your perfect interior vacation spot. The secret persona itself is something that's cultivated like any of these are developed. Because remember, they're developments in this empirical world for you to engage with the empirical world. When you have a secret persona, we all have that because we all have a time in which we have to put on the role by ourselves where we're not just private, we're not just by ourselves, but we need to go to that holiest of holies. We need to go to the most interior part of ourselves that leaves out the other feelings and the other thoughts and the other demands and resolutions and just allows us to be who we are in quietude. And this differs from the theosic self, which is the self in which you believe, you feel, and you depend upon a sense of other, something that is greater than oneself, of which you are a part of, as the one self, a self, you are part of the self, the one self. And the way that the individual, and we all develop this at some point in our lives, the way that we confront and coincide with that sense of magnitude, that immensity that enfolds us all and of which we are merely a part of, but we are made the most precious part of because of the advancing self. that self which is always presenting itself new, spontaneously. It's energetic and it's novel. It always comes up with something new. And yet it's unifying and it's pure because it came out of nowhere. It goes to nowhere. And what do I mean by nowhere? I mean no specific empirical place. It resides in the transfinite part of the universe we call the soul, our mind. Our brain, we'll go into another time. Those are two very different things, mind and brain, as different as soul and soma, as different as the finite and the transfinite. However, what is important to understand is that as self-conscious souls that have feelings and thoughts and intentions and commitments, as well as vital impulses and drives that bring us forward into activity, having all these things in the inner scape finds an outlet because we compose the melodies and we compose the stories that go with those melodies, and they're called our personae. The 24 personae that I've touched upon today, these are things that all of us have as potentials within our personality. We, as the conductor, can call upon these more consciously or less consciously as we are inclined. However, these personae are there. And at all times, that conductor is only playing what you've composed as the self-conscious being you are. So, until the next time we meet, this is your philosopher at large, Tristan McGough, who's wishing you well and reminding you to behave when you must. Be good whenever you can. But above all else, be yourself.